On a dark, gloomy night in October 1946, 16-year-old Ruth Finley returned to her house in Fort Scott, Kansas. A man behind the front door of her home waited with ill intentions for the teenager, who would be haunted by the incident that was about to happen for the rest of her life. As Ruth entered the door, the man grabbed her from behind. Unprepared for what was coming next, Ruth fearlessly poked the man's eyes with her thumbs, enraging him, which resulted in the man shredding her clothes and beating her till she fell unconscious. Slowly fading away from her brutal reality, the last thing Ruth saw was the man heating up the flat iron on the stove. As Ruth wakes up from this horrifying dream, the whole of Fort Scott was terrorized by the news of the assault on this innocent teenager by a maniac. Shocked to the core, the 16-year-old finds herself branded by her abuser. The man had burned both of Ruth's thighs with a hot flat iron. Fast forward to a humid night in June 1977. Ruth Finley is now a 47-year-old telephone company employee, a mother of 2 grown sons, and a wife to her very faithful husband, Ed. Many years later, Ruth is once again taken back to her terrible past via a phone call. On this night in June, Ed is hospitalized after collapsing from an apparent heart attack in the backyard of their Wichita, Kansas home, and Ruth has to return and spend the night all alone in their house. As Ruth tries to shake off the unfamiliar feeling of spending the night alone in the house, she turns on the radio to divert her mind. But the radio has filled the air with horrific news about the BTK, the first serial killer of Wichita, who has so far killed 7 people in a span of 3 years. Suddenly, the telephone begins to ring. "Is this Ruth Smark from Fort Scott, Kansas?" A male with a deep voice asks from the other side. Chills went down her spine. Smock was her maiden name, and she hasn't been to her hometown in decades. "I know all about that night." And then the man begins to read a decades-old news article in his deep, demonic voice, branded on both thighs by a hot flat iron, apparently by a sex maniac. Ruth Smock, a 16-year-old high school girl, rests in her parents' house after being attacked last night. The man then asks Ruth if she still wore his brand. The 47-year-old Ruth is shaken by the question. This unknown man is calling her late at night, knows her whereabouts, and is threatening to spread the news of her teenage trauma if she doesn't give him money. Ruth slams the phone down and calms herself to sleep. Some weeks later, Ed recovers from his sickness and comes back to the house. Ruth doesn't tell her husband about the phone call. The couple continues to live a peaceful life in their one-story wood frame house in Wichita, Kansas, not knowing that the stability in their lives is about to vanish. Ruth is sitting in her office when she receives a letter from an unknown person. The woman is once again shaken to her core as she opens the letter to find out a decades-old news article about the abuse that happened to her in her teenage years. Ruth tears down the article and throws its shredded pieces in the dustbin. But the phone call makes a comeback once again. Ruth slams the phone down every time she hears the devilish voice of the man who demands money. But when Ed attends to the phone, he only hears a dial tone at the other end. The never-ending phone calls would make Ruth's life a living hell for the next several months. These phone calls soon turned into real-life encounters on the street. Ruth finally meets the man who has been calling her for the past year in a crowded street downtown in Wichita. The first time she sees the guy, Ruth was more annoyed than frightened. She tells her husband about the strange man but doesn't tell him about the phone calls. Ed shakes off the incident thinking it was just a guy hitting on his pretty wife. But the next time Ruth encounters the man, he grabs her by the wrist and shouts at her in his deep, menacing voice. Terrified by the audacity of this man, Ruth runs off to her friend's apartment where she informs Ed about the situation. This is when Ruth breaks the silence on the threatening phone call she had been receiving for a year. Ed is naturally deeply worried for his beloved wife. He decides to take this matter to the authorities. Lieutenant Bernie Juratsky meets the couple in his office where Ed tells him about the threatening phone calls and abusive encounters faced by his wife. However, Lieutenant Bernie from the Criminal Investigation Division did not have so much time to pursue a case as minor as Ruth's. Quotes on the minor: "He was already swamped with tips about the BTK serial killer and had no intentions of seriously taking Ruth's misery into account. But then, letter after letter from this evil human began to overwhelm Ruth and Ed. Lieutenant Juratsky couldn't help but notice a connection. The words would rhyme and have a deep similarity with the terrifying letters the victims would receive from the grotesque serial killer of Wichita, the BTK. Ed gives the evil man a name: Bind, Torture, Killstalker. Because of the rhyming nature of the letters, he began to call him the Poet. Soon, the police would follow suit, and later, the whole of Wichita began to call this man the Poet. Even though his poems were neither artistic nor had a deeper meaning, they would only threaten or sexualize poor Ruth and demand money in return for peace. The kidnapping attempts. While all of this was happening on November 21st, 1978, Ruth was abducted from a desolate street near the North Market. The same man pulled up near the sidewalk and forcefully dragged Ruth into his green Bel Air. Luckily, Ruth managed to escape the kidnapping and ran toward the street. She called her husband Ed, who drove towards the police headquarters to find his wife crouched in a chair, barefoot, her face red from crying. Lieutenant Dowatsky briefed Ed about the incident, how the man took his wife's money and how Ruth managed to flee from the forest. He told Ed that no injuries were inflicted upon his wife. Little did Lieutenant Dowatsky know that the next encounter would become a near-death experience. The next time the Criminal Investigation Division would receive a call, Ruth would utter the words, "I have been stabbed." Some days earlier, the letters had stopped pouring in. Ed and Ruth decide to go on a summer trip to a ranch in Colorado. Away from all their worries, Ruth goes on a shopping spree, but ends up getting stabbed while resisting abduction by her stalker. The wound was 2 inches deep. Had it been deeper, the injury would have been deathly. Ruth stayed in the hospital for 9 days, the population of Wichita grew fearful of the monstrous attacks on the innocent lady. At this point, the police had interviewed more than 300 people, but Ruth would fail to identify her stalker every time. The letters were shown to a psycholinguist, Dr. Murray S. Myron, who concluded that the writer of these letters was clearly and severely psychotic, schizophrenic, extremely dangerous, and a loner. Ruth is now being guarded by 8 undercover police officers. However, none of them witness any unusual activity around the woman. They know the poet. Then came a turning point in the case of Ruth Finley. In September 1981, Chief Richard LeMunion's wife, Sharon, received a threatening letter from the same man. The chief decides to take matters into his own hands. On the evening of September 4th, 1981, LeMunion took bulky files of Ruth's case back to his home. Over the weekend, the chief studied the case, made notes, visualized the incidents, and by the end of the week, he knew exactly who the poet was. On September 11th, LeMunyon called for a meeting in the Civil Preparedness Room, specifically designed to keep the staff safe during natural disasters. He wanted to keep the discussion confidential. LeMunyon called 16 officers to the room and warned to not breathe a word of this meeting out in public. If the news went to the media, all 16 of the officers would be fired. Without wasting a second, the chief broke the news. The poet is indeed Ruth Finley herself. But why would LeMunyon make such a bold claim about the innocent Ruth? The chief had his reasons that were backed by strong facts. First, none of the encounters Ruth faced had any witnesses, even though they happened in a public space. Secondly, none of the undercover police officers detected the poet near the couple's house, even though the couple lived on the dead end of the street with barely any traffic. Thirdly, when Ruth was stabbed with a knife on her back, why did she call the Crime Investigations Department instead of the emergency dispatchers? How did she manage to drive her car, call the police, and then drive back to her home, all while being stabbed in the back? LeMunyon flooded the officers with reasons that Ruth Finley is lying. Now the question was, is Ed in this with Ruth? Or is he oblivious to his wife's actions? Very soon, the investigations begin in strict confidentiality, and the investigators find Ruth mailing herself a letter from the poet. Ed was taken into questioning, but Lieutenant Dowatsky finds him innocent. Ruth is now taken into the interrogation room where Lieutenant Dowatsky tells her about the new finding in her case. Ruth is shocked to discover the truth as deep-rooted memories in her mind flash right in front of her eyes. She is her own stalker. The pill was naturally hard to swallow. Even though the case of Ruth Finley cost the police department a whopping sum of $370,000, the Sedgwick County District Attorney decided to not pursue the criminal investigation since Ruth's actions as the poet were not vicious. Ruth Finley was then put into a psychiatric ward at St. Joseph's Hospital where Dr. Pickens would uncover her ingrained childhood trauma. Dr. Pickens discovers that Ruth was assaulted by her neighbor and family friend in her childhood. But Ruth had separated herself from that girl that was assaulted. She felt as if she was floating off to the heavens. She could look down at the girl, but it wasn't her, so it didn't hurt, expressed Ruth. When Dr. Pickens inquired about her past, because Ruth had so much to uncover, Dr. Pickens did not insist on getting deeper into the teenage burning incident faced by her. Ruth hid the childhood trauma in her heart for more than 40 years. Dr. Pickens believed it was her husband's hospitalization that brought back her trauma to the surface. Ruth was diagnosed with dissociative personality disorder, or DPD, as it's more commonly known as. The diagnosis was met with a positive response from the public. Everybody in the neighborhood empathized with Ruth, who endured such pain in her childhood. Her family stood by her. And eventually, Ruth came forward to tell her story in a local news program to help other survivors. She died at the age of 89 on May 30th, 2019.